He was in a position of extraordinary opportunity, just like the commanders of the Myanmar military in 1962. He had risen up the ranks rapidly by chance as much as merit. He had saved the kingdom. His king trusted him. Instead, he made the decision. A decision that ultimately benefited the country, but at the cost of his hard-earned reputation in Burmese history. By 1769, Qing Empire had launched the largest invasion of Burma before World War II. Before the Burmese could reach the borders, Phu Hung's forces surrounded the Burmese garrison at Canton Fort and built a massive fortification near the Shwenaungbin Village. From their forward positions, the Qing constructed a naval flotilla to navigate the Ayeyarwady River. The Qing plan was to strike the Burmese capital at Ava through the Ayeyarwady with 2 land armies supported by a naval flotilla, while a third force would take Canton Fort and hold off any militia forces fielded by Ava's Qing, Kachin, and Shan vessels. However, Phu Hung found himself unable to control the situation. First of all, the Qing Navy was unable to control the river from Banya'an, the ethnic Mon nobleman who had commanded the Burmese Navy. Banya'an was able to resupply the Canton garrison and transport Burmese troops past the Qing defensive lines. Qing detachments sent out to control the perimeter were also beaten back into the fort. Still, the main imperial armies remained intact, and the Burmese were unable to threaten the Shwenaungbin stronghold, nor were they able to take full control of the Ayeyarwady River. Furthermore, while the Qing forces at the eastern bank of the river remained holed up at Shwenaungbin, the western bank army was still free to move. While the Burmese land armies met up under General Nemyo Sithu and Pierre de Milad proceeded to lay siege to the Shwenaungbin fort, the Qing Western Bank Army was free to cross the river. The army duly followed its plan and managed to cross the Ayeyarwady, and had begun to move down with the bulk of the Qing naval flotilla. However, the Qing commander feared going too far from the stronghold alone. The Qing armies did not fear engaging the Burmese directly in the open fields, but the crippling guerrilla attacks had left a deep impression on the imperial forces, and it made their movements predictable as they tried to avoid deep vegetations and ambush spots. What happened next surprised both sides. When the Burmese troops guarding the western bank approached, the Qing army suddenly chose to fall back to the eastern bank. It is not certain why they did it. Perhaps they feared another feint to draw them into a trap. Regardless, their departure left the Burmese completely occupying the western bank, and with the eastern bank army still stuck in Shwenaungbin, the Qing naval flotilla was left completely exposed. Taking full advantage of it, Banya'an rushed forward with the Burmese naval fleet. The Qing commanders from Shwenaungbin Fort watched in horror as hundreds of Mon, Karen, and Rakhine boatmen paddled their dragon boats into the docked Qing flotilla and burned them to the ground. Banya'an then, with reinforcements from Mahathira, took the entire fleet to attack the Qing naval blockade at Canton. The better prepared Qing fleet there managed to survive the initial attack, but were eventually overrun. Having taken full control of the Ayeyarwady River, Banya'an signaled Nemyo Sithu. The Burmese troops charged from 4 sides with ladders, rams, and even war elephants. The Qing senior officers stood on the wall with their men as they fended off storming parties of Burmese and braved European musket fire. The superior discipline of the Qing military proved itself in this battle, and the Qing managed to repel most of the Burmese attacks and inflict heavy casualties on the Burmese. However, in one particular section, the Burmese broke through. Using low-caliber cannon and swivel guns mounted on war elephants as covering fire, the Burmese soldiers managed to use their battering rams to smash through the gate and storm the section. There, they managed to take over the armory in the area, capturing a significant number of Qing muskets, cannon, and gunpowder. Phu Hung, fearing that the Burmese would exploit this position, withdrew a large number of troops besieging Canton to their stronghold. The Qing were able to prevent the Burmese from proceeding further. However, they were also unable to recapture the portions of the fort in Burmese hands. As both sides stood down for a breather, Phu Hung suddenly chose to concentrate all his forces on the Canton fort. Why he chose to attack Canton rather than engage the Burmese land armies is hard to say, but it seemed to be a particular grudge against the fort itself. Since the start of the war, Canton Fort had been instrumental in creating troubles for the Qing. Another possible reason could be that he wanted to create another fortified position in Burmese land, particularly since the Qing army believed that they would be far more vulnerable in the Burmese jungles. With the full might of the Qing falling down on them, the Canton fort wavered. The defenders fought ferociously, pouring down heavy gunfire, boiling oil, and many times the battle elements exchanged hands. However, without the Qing blockade, Banyaun was able to reinforce and resupply the beleaguered garrison. With fresh supplies and reinforcements, and under the creative and energetic leadership of Bala Mindin, the defenders stood firm for weeks. The Burmese accounts also mention the bravery of the Qing soldiers who continued to attack despite being torn to shreds by heavy musket fire. Hearing the condition of the expedition, the emperor sent orders for a full retreat. But it was too late, as the Burmese force under Deng Mingaon had succeeded in destroying and capturing the Qing supply depots and completely cut the lines of communications from Yunnan. He then took his forces down on the Qing rear. Once again, the Qing army was hit with disease. Despite precautions, the sheer size of the Qing force in one single area made it particularly vulnerable to such outbreaks. Fu Heng himself was struck down with fever. The momentum of the attacks on the Canton fort also fell with the disease. Fu Heng's deputy, Wu Kui, had taken over the expedition. He had initially lost favor for not being supportive of Fu Heng's invasion plans. Seeing the condition of the Qing army and having suffered over 20,000 casualties, Wu Kui and the other Qing commanders asked the Burmese for terms. The Burmese commanders laughed at the messenger, stating that the Qing were in no position to make any demand, as they were trapped like fish in a net, and the Burmese merely had to wait until the Qing all starved to death. However, despite his successes, Mahathira saw things differently. The Burmese losses against the Qing were light in comparison, but until the fourth invasion, they had been fighting on multiple fronts, and together with the losses from the 2-year war against Ayutthaya, they were becoming very heavy. Furthermore, the Burmese kingdom had been continuously at war for almost 10 years. The stream of successes had made war popular among the Burmese, but Mahathira knew that it was only a matter of time before it would all start crashing down. He was recorded to have said, "Comrades, unless we make peace, yet another invasion will come, and when we defeated it, yet another will come. Our nation cannot go on just repelling invasion after invasion of the Chinese, for we have other things to do. Let us stop the slaughter and let their people and our people live in peace." His commanders did not agree and demanded blood. They wanted to make an example out of the Qing for their invasions. Furthermore, they had warned that the king would never accept such terms, not while they held the upper hand. Mahathira knew that better than most people, for he had known the king since he was a prince. Mahathira took full responsibility and gave the Qing terms without informing the king. The terms followed. The Chinese would surrender all the Sorbas, or Shan lords, and other rebels and fugitives from Burmese justice who had taken shelter in Chinese territory. The Chinese would undertake to respect Burmese sovereignty over those Shan states that had been historically part of Burma. All prisoners of war would be released. The Emperor of China and the King of Burma would resume friendly relations, regularly exchanging emissaries bearing letters of goodwill and presents. Fu Heng was furious with the treaty. When the Qing officers hesitated, Mahathira threatened to massacre them again, just as he did with Mingri's army at Mimyo. Fu Heng was still opposed to any treaty, but Wu Kui and the other Qing commanders overruled him and they signed the treaty at Canton Fort. The Burmese forces stood down and watched as the disease-ridden Qing army made the deadly march back to Yunnan, where many would die along the way. Both monarchs were unhappy with the treaty. Fu Heng would die from malaria on his way back to the imperial capital, and thus, Wu Kui was forced to bear the brunt of the emperor's anger. The Jinlong emperor blamed Wu Kui and the other Qing military leaders for not stopping Fu Heng's decision if they had known that it would fail. Fortunately for the commanders, a rebellion broke out in western Sichuan, and their suppression of the rebels eased the emperor's anger. Still, the emperor refused to honor any of the points in the treaty. Although he would call the resumption of diplomacy with Burma in 1790 as a sign of submission and conclude the war as an eventual Qing victory, the emperor also conceded that the war had made the Burmese look down on the Qing. Despite the heavy military lineup by both sides for the next 10 years, it was the last major war fought between Burma and China. Professor Ying Kong Dai called it the most disastrous frontier war that the Qing Dynasty had ever waged. Although many would consider it as the beginning of decline for the Qing military, it is more fair to say that the Qing armies were not equipped to fight in the geography and the terrain of Southeast Asia. In 1789, nearly 10 years after the Canton Treaty, the Tay-son Vietnamese forces would inflict another deadly defeat on the Qing, and with very similar tactics. Despite the astonishing victory, the Burmese court was furious with their commanders. The King Sempushan had torn his copy of his treaty, and for months the Burmese armies were too afraid to return south. They would only return after suppressing a rebellion in Manipur. Mahathira's decision was met with mixed reception. Some welcomed the peace after so many years of war, but most were angered by this apparent show of weakness. Burmese historian Mountain Owl commented that the Burmese as a nation had become drunk with victory and grew arrogant and aggressive. The returning soldiers, for all their hard fighting, did not receive a hero's welcome, but were humiliated and were given women's dresses, in other words saying that they did not have the balls to be soldiers. Mahathira, to his credit, took full responsibility and asked only mercy for his subordinates. The hero of the Sino-Burmese War and his commanders were banished to remote outposts in the Shan states. It would take another decade before Mahathira would regain royal favor. Despite such a spectacular victory, the Burmese were never able to achieve the same successes on such a scale again. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series. The story of Mahathira had been the main motivation for this series, and as a Burmese myself, it is with great shame that I found out that more people outside of Burma knew and appreciated his military exploits than his own people. Why the Burmese military never promoted him is puzzling. Perhaps they feared being compared to him. One would think that with half a century of nationalist military rule, the leaders of the Burmese military would use him as a propaganda tool. Only when living under the rule of the generals who had abused their power and responsibility, Mahathira is once again remembered. Historian Mountain Owl wrote that we must praise him not only for his wisdom, but for his selflessness, as it was clear that he knew the consequences of his actions, but chose to do it regardless. And with that, I would like to conclude the series on the Sino-Burmese War. If you guys enjoy videos like this, comment down below and press the subscribe button. Thanks, and stay safe everyone.